Welcome all, I'm Rusty Hall here with the second session of our MOPsCON Spring Preview. Our session for the hour is going to be a DIY approach to activating your existing Marketo data. Our presenter today is Eric Wong. These sessions, as I said, are meant to give you a taste of the kind of content that we're lining up for our full fall virtual event, MOPsCON 2020. Since you've registered for our spring preview, you'll also be receiving a discount code for the full registration for MOPsCON in September. So more information on that to come in a follow-up email. We will also be opening up a call for speakers, so be looking for additional information coming around speakers and the agenda coming soon for our fall MOPsCON event. We are going to be recording all of these spring preview sessions, and we're going to make those recordings available on demand, as well as make those slides available for download in a post follow-up email. So you check in your inboxes. We'll be coming out with that shortly at the end of the week. That'll have links to these sessions and the slide decks. Two quick housekeeping notes. We will be having a live Q&A at the end of each one of these sessions, so feel free to use the Zoom QA chat panel. You can go ahead and pop your questions in there, and then once we get to the end of the session, we'll go ahead and answer those as time allows, while we have Eric to pick his brain at the end for the QA. I'd also like to say that I understand that the majority of us are working from home, streaming remotely. It's kind of a new remote environment. So if we do run into any technical difficulties, please just bear with us. We'll do our best to resolve those technical difficulties and get back to you as soon as possible, relaunch the webinar, and make sure that, that everybody's got audio and can see all of the content slides that we have today. So just a caveat while we're working in this kind of remote reality. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker, Eric Wong. Eric, if you can give us just a little bit of an introduction, a little background about yourself, and from there you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rusty. I actually am opting to switch that up a little bit and tell everyone about the session today first, and then I will be happily giving a quick intro about myself as well. Sorry to throw off your process there.
Not a problem. That's why we do it live.
Alrighty, so as I was saying, let's go ahead and talk about what we are going to discuss today. This is the agenda for our session. First, I want to set a baseline around what it is about why is it important for us to know, own, and activate our own marketing data. That's kind of that first piece, setting the stage. I'd like to spend most of today actually talking through specific dashboarding and reporting analysis scenarios. This isn't meant to be exhaustive. It's not meant to, be everything under the sun. It's more to give you an idea of what you can do and the power that you can extract from the data if you activate your marketing data. Finally, I want to talk about some of the tools and resourcing that you'll need to activate your own data. Do want to set a caveat, right? This isn't about the bright, shiny objects or the greatest and latest MarTech. There are obviously some end-to-end comprehensive, or not comprehensive, I should say, more plug and play out there. I have nothing against them, but in my experience, in many cases, you'll be able to answer a few or handful of questions very well, but it kind of stops there. And it's often very difficult in the black box environment of, like a plug and play MarTech analytics solution. It's often difficult to figure out the why behind the what. And even if you can figure out the why, it can be pretty tedious because you still have to go back to your source systems anyway. And so what I'm going to talk about today is why it's generally better to have even a rudimentary BI, capability and infrastructure as we start treating data more as a strategic resource, right? This is about owning, knowing, and activating your marketing data. And I would say a starting point for building a marketing intelligence discipline. And like Rusty was saying, a little bit about myself. So you guys already know, I'm sure, I'm a marketing intelligence consultant at Atumos. Before here, I spent the last 16 years or so of my career in B2B and B2C marketing. specifically focused around data management, analytics, and operations. The last handful of years, I've been leading both marketing operations as well as analytics disciplines at a couple of different companies. There's some information down there if you want to connect. One thing I do like to say is that, I've been working in marketing operations before marketing operations as kind of a discipline was coined, at least to the prevalence that it is today. The tool set was different, right? And what we call it is also different. But the job description actually hasn't changed dramatically over the years. About 14 years ago, I was a marketing analyst at Expedia. A big part of my responsibility there was doing audience pre-analysis for audience targeting. All of this was done in a SQL database, right? Experimental design, breaking out different audience groups with different messaging and different form factors to see what resonated, list pools for email, direct mail and event marketing campaigns, analysis and reporting and optimization recommendations, data management and cleansing. All of those were part of my responsibility, using kind of an earlier tech stack, which is essentially a SQL database and Excel and some light visualization tools, right? Why do I like to start with that? Because really, even though marketing operations has kind of come a long way, the fundamentals of it and the importance of data and the importance of extracting insights from data really has not changed dramatically. And so, some of the methodologies that may be considered more traditional, like how you build a database and how you extract insights, still apply. And that's why I want to talk to you guys today about how to activate your own marketing data. So let's go ahead and dive right in. First, I'm going to start with a quote. This is actually a quote from the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago now, almost 2 years ago. Data are becoming ubiquitous, so at first blush, it would appear that analytics should be able to deliver on its promise of value creation. However, data grows on its own terms, and this growth is often driven by IT investments rather than by coherent marketing goals. As a result, data libraries often look like the proverbial cluttered closet, where it's hard to separate the insights from the junk. Now, some of this is still, actually, I would say 90% of this is still relevant, right? This still resonates very much with me, and I think many of the companies I've worked for, as well as the clients that I work with. And I wager that it probably resonates with many of you as well. Many of the IT, or I should say tech investments, are no longer necessarily driven by IT, right? Depends on the company. But marketing and sales and just general business operations is driving a lot more of that data investment and the infrastructure investment, tools investment. However, I would argue that data still grows on its own terms, right? Take a look at your MarTech stack. Take a look at how many tools you have generating data across the different channels that you are executing against, across the databases that you're working against. Oftentimes, it is difficult to wrangle all that data together, right? And resulting very similarly to a cluttered closet where it's hard to separate the insights from the junk. We don't lack data by any means, right? Especially with all the MarTech out there. What we lack is the right platform and capabilities to make the best use of that data. Another quote, I promise this is the last one before we move on. If I'm the CEO of a company, so this is from Forbes, well, almost 2 years ago, actually closer to a year and a half, but I would say, I would put money on this piece that, this probably resonates with most of us in the webinar today, right? If I'm the CEO and unhappy with sales, I go to the sales team to understand, but they may blame marketing. Each team uses its own data because they want to preserve the data set that supports their point of view. In this pattern of behavior, if you control your own data, no one can hold you accountable. If you control your own data, no one can hold you accountable. Silos defeat collaboration and stymie value creation. So it amazes me, right? A year and a half later, after this Forbes article, and really it amazes me in this day and age in general that many companies, whether you're startups or enterprises or enterprise level companies or size companies, many many of us still have marketing and sales, MBRs, right? Monthly business reviews or quarterly business reviews that are completely separate from one another, right? Whether you're talking to a board or your executive team, oftentimes it's like marketing does its presentation with its own data set and its own tools. And sales does its own presentation with its own data set and its own tools. The two are inherently related, but often they'll have completely different stories, and it's hard for executive teams and people making the decisions to really distill what the most useful information is and where they need to make optimizations. And that's another part of the reason why it's important to own your data. The purpose of marketing intelligence, the purpose of analytics, is to drive optimization and strategic decisions. Data silos, by definition, is an impediment to that, right? We end up spending a majority of our time arguing about whose data is right and less so around how to optimize and how to make the right decisions. Ultimately, where we want to land is this, right? A unified marketing performance framework, right? We've got the key marketing levers that we typically can pull. We all know this implicitly. We know we can, determine who to target. We know we can determine what channels to distribute that content or experience through, and then we know what content or experience to send out to our prospects and our customers, right? To move them through that funnel. We know those are the marketing levers. We know what the marketing funnel looks like, and approximately where we need to drive people. And we kind of know what the measurement is, right? And we've got the leading indicators in engagement rate. We've got kind of your top of funnel or mid funnel indicators, conversion, velocity, with value and ROI. How do we throw all of those things together? Well, I tend to think this hypothesis that I threw up here is helpful for that, right? Contextualizing that. Marketing execution against audience targeting, channels for message and experience delivery, and content selection directly drive prospect and customer engagement, which in turn impacts funnel conversion and velocity and business value. That's the idea anyway. Ultimately, as marketers and marketing intelligence specialists, this is what we're trying to prove out. And I will say that every single one of these points is an opportunity for data capture. So how do we solve the problem of disparate data and data silos and get to this, right? Get to the core of this, where we can start telling that end-to-end marketing story? Well, I like to start simply, like many of us, I'm sure, right? The best way to solve a problem is oftentimes break it down into bite-sized chunks, start small, and solve it one problem at a time or one step at a time. And we're all familiar with data silos, right? Just take a look at your MarTech stack, right? You've got your paid media platforms, you've got your social media platforms, you've got your marketing automation stack, you've got your webinar tools, you've got your CRMs, right? Those are all data silos in and of themselves, obviously. And I think those are the obvious pieces. I will argue, though, a simpler place to start is to deal with the data silo that you have right in front of you, and many of us are in day to day. That's going to be the marketing automation system. We're all familiar with leads, right? The lead object. The samples here are very Marketo centric, but really you can apply a lot of these principles to just about any marketing automation platform. We're familiar with leads. We deal with them on a daily basis, right? You've got the firmographics, the demographics, technographics, and then you've got your behavioral summaries, your business outcomes, whatnot. And we are very comfortable reporting on these on a day-to-day. How many leads do we have? How many leads of a certain type do we have? And how many leads came in at a certain point in time, right? Those are all common questions that we're able to answer. And there are other pieces that fall into this in your typical marketing automation system. We've got the programs and we've got the activities. The programs will report on that as well, right? Like, how did this program perform? How many acquisitions did we get? How many successes did we get? How many people did A, B, or C, or X, Y, or Z, right? For a particular email, you start looking at activities maybe, how many sends, how many opens, how many clicks, how many registrations, right? But that is the context in which we typically ask the questions and answer the questions. And if you think about it, there's actually not a whole lot of cross object or cross table insights that we're typically extracting from these three very rich data sources, right? Leads is like a glorified Excel spreadsheet, right? And programs is related to it, but most of us don't have the means to really do effective analysis against it, and activity is very much the same. What if you could ask some different business questions, right? Like, what types of programs are more likely to influence funnel progression or opportunity pipeline? We're implicitly getting into things like attribution reporting and funnel reporting, whatnot. What about what kinds of emails get the most engagement, right? We don't typically report on that type of thing or do that type of analysis because we're looking at each email individually, independently, and seeing how they perform, rather than looking at it in part of a bigger picture of how that influences the revenue and pipeline and the funnel progression. What about how many emails is too many? What frequency of emails is too frequent? Or who are our most engaged prospects? And does engagement actually equate to pipeline and revenue? Once again, we start getting into kind of that attribution and buyer journey conversation, right? We can cobble some of those answers together using out-of-the-box tools. But I would argue that to get the level of depth that will allow us to make a lot of business decisions and then to answer multiple questions simultaneously within the same context gets a little more difficult if you don't know, own, and activate your own data. So let's go ahead and get started with the samples that I was talking about earlier. Hopefully this gives you an idea of how we can use the data to our advantage. This is an example of a buyer journey dashboard that we build for ourselves as well as for our clients. Don't worry, this is all sample data. Part of the reason why the data set is so small, right? And so there's no risk of some corporate insights that we're divulging here. So I'm going to start on the upper left in this particular case, the MQL journey for an individual lead. Essentially what this is it shows at a high level, what is this lead doing, or what did this lead do the 60 days leading up to becoming an MQL. What does this tell you, right? Well, 55 days before this person became an MQL, they engaged with a webinar. And 41 days before, they engaged with an email nurture, 40 days before content, and so on and so forth, until finally the last day, they consumed the final piece of content, which scoring kicked them over to becoming an MQL. Wonderful. What does this tell you? Honestly, not a whole lot, to be perfectly honest. Where this does become more powerful, though, is when you start overlaying this in groups of people, right? And you start looking for patterns that emerge amongst multiple people. And think about this, if you start overlaying this with buyer personas, with firmographic data or demographic data or technographic profile, you start to see different usage patterns emerge, right? And this is where you can start getting some real insights around how to best leverage this data and what direction to move with either your content or your frequency of communication or your nurture or whatnot. Even just looking at this chart, which I admittedly is a bit of an eye chart, but even looking at this chart, you can start seeing some patterns emerge, such as, for example, a lot of people, right, are kind of hitting MQL on that last day. Why? Because, like many other companies, this data set has a hand raiser lead scoring mechanism, right? And so you can see the hand raise form on that last day contributes to quite a bit of the MQL scoring here. And you can see that content is a very important driver, right? Making sure that you have enough of the right content, that's a very important driver, especially in the world of scalability, to get people over that threshold. Another way to look at it, right? We've got the top 20 leads in this particular bucket, and you can start seeing kind of where their engagement patterns are. Once again, this view isn't necessarily the most useful, right? But you start breaking that out in different ways, like, hey, you know what? My goal is to drive more MQLs. How do I do that? How do I get people across the finish line? You can start seeing patterns emerge around when people might be more interested in content versus nurture versus, attending trade shows or webinars. Now, of course, some of this is going to be somewhat seasonal in the sense that, hosted events or trade shows are only going to happen at certain points in time, and so you still this doesn't take out the contextual, the business context aspect of it. You can't just look at the data in isolation and drive business decisions. However, this does give you the tool, right? And we move into even a higher level kind of aggregate and look at this chart saying that, hey, you know what? On average, it takes 1.4 engagements per person to get to an MQL, and overwhelmingly, content is an important driver in getting people over that hump. This starts getting you into a world where you can have conversations with product marketing, and around how best to plan content and content needs, right? This also, by the way, this whole journey is a precursor, like all the foundational work here is a precursor to something more advanced in the world of marketing attribution, reporting, and analysis. Which incidentally brings us to the next slide here, right? What you don't see here is that out of this sample data set, $1.5 million, there are a total of $1.5 million worth of revenue and bookings. So we've all heard of attribution reporting, multi-touch attribution, whatnot. I don't know how many of us are effectively bringing these to business planning and revenue planning as well as budget planning conversations. But how powerful of a message is it, right? If you can say that out of the $1.5 million worth of revenue or bookings, this isn't like, this view doesn't even represent pipeline, right? This represents revenue and bookings. Out of the $1.5 million, 50% of them, almost $750,000 was influenced by marketing in some way or form within 60 days before the opportunity opened. Another thing that's not on here that I'm just going to speak to is that if we extend that window to 180 days, nearly 80% of the overall revenue was in some way touched by marketing. So this obviously allows you to assign some sense of business credit to your marketing activities based on audience engagement. Now, I'm not here to talk to you about the best attribution models or the best look back windows. In fact, those are the types of insights, the types of things that you would do well to actually analyze your data. What is your average sales cycle? What is the sales cycle that captures 80% of your needs, right? Or 80% of your conversions, 90% of your conversions. You need to do that analysis in order to come up with a best look back window and the best way to do the attribution. But if you own the data, right, making those pivots tends to be a little easier. A conversation that might happen, right, that stems out of this might be that your web team might say, hey, you know what? I think there is an opportunity to squeeze an extra few percentage points of conversion optimization, which might result in X dollars benefit to the company. The paid media team might come back and say something similar, right? That, hey, you know what? I could probably spend a little more on, X and Y channels to drive an additional 20% in traffic, which will yield Z dollars in benefit, right? This type of reporting and this type of insights can yield those types of conversations, which I personally find to be much more valuable and much more useful than, hey, whose data is right? So how do we go about and enable this? And we'll talk about tooling, we'll talk about, resourcing at a later point, but I'd already mentioned this earlier, right, in the data silo slide, but essentially in your marketing automation, you've got your delineation between your lead records, and then you've got your program membership records. We all implicitly know this, but once again, I don't necessarily feel like all of us are using this data to its maximum effectiveness. And by the way, I absolutely recommend that, anytime you have major life cycle stage changes, you should explicitly date timestamp that information, right? That it makes for a lot more easier kind of analysis and reporting. It makes your life a whole lot easier. This is something that's a part of the standard Atumos marketing architecture framework. And so it's something we can absolutely help you with as well, our platform operations team. But how do you go about and process this data in a way that allows you to tell that story? Now, this animation is going to make it look a little easier than it actually is. Obviously, there is a little bit of complexity to it, but essentially you take all of those different programs that the person engaged with and you start stitching that together into a logical journey, right? That allows you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do, which is to say, hey, you know what? We do some time series analysis and say, what are we optimizing against? Are we optimizing against MQLs? Are we optimizing against SQLs? Are we optimizing against closed-won opportunities? And you start tracing the steps back to say, hey, you know what? 15 days before this person became an MQL, they consumed a piece of content. 1 day before they became an MQL, they engaged with a webinar. Wonderful, right? Once again, this is not, this in and of itself isn't going to yield the insights, but when you start layering this in groups of people and groups of behavior, you start seeing patterns emerge that do allow you to start making business decisions. This data is typically stored in, your Marketo programs, lists, activity logs, but you can equally, you can do this analysis equally well using Salesforce data, right? Salesforce campaigns and campaign members store this information as well. But really, the problem isn't that you aren't storing this data. The problem has more to do with the fact that most of us can't make effective use of it within the systems that's capturing them. Here's another example, lead funnel velocity. This is something that's near and dear to my heart, right? I would argue that you do not truly understand your conversions if you don't take into account velocity. And conversion and velocity analysis and reporting, it's typically most useful in a cohort context. And cohort is just really a fancy way of saying, segment, right? Except most cohorts are typically grouped within segments of time, meaning, hey, when did this person come in? We'll group everyone that came in Q1 or in January together. And we follow them through their path of engagement to see what they do as a group, right? So let's start on the upper left again, right? So we've got, first of all, up top, additional context, we've got the, lead trending of people that came in. MALs are market accepted leads. It's a part of the Tumos framework. You can think of it in terms of known, right? They're known users. So if you start trending this, trending the group, you start seeing what channels brought these leads in, right? So why is that important? Well, I like to look at conversion and velocity, once again, in terms of cohorts. And the cohorts themselves may have different performance or yield different behavior based on the lead source that brought them in. It could be based on any number of things. It could be based on their persona. It could be based on their company size, the firmographics, demographics. So how you slice and dice it is going to be the key. What you see here is that even though the average conversion rate between a known and MQL is essentially 17%, you see that there's quite a bit of variability depending on when that known person came into the funnel, right? In February, you'll see that there's 35% conversion rate. And on average, it took about 41 days to convert, which is different than January, which is different than July. Now, this particular piece in and of itself doesn't tell us a whole lot. I do like to pepper in, however, the distribution of the average number of days it takes to convert. And the reason why this is important is not necessarily because of this MAL to MQL conversion, but really further down funnel, right? And you can see you really can start optimizing your conversions and your velocity across the entire funnel, across in specific segments of the funnel, whatnot. Now, once again, why is this piece important? Especially the distribution. I'm sure many of us have gone through and done business planning, reverse waterfall exercises, budget planning, revenue forecasting, lead forecasting, right? I certainly have. And I will admit that I didn't used to take velocity into account. And even when I took velocity into account, I didn't necessarily do the best job of it, meaning I kind of fell into a common trap of using average velocities. Now, why is that important? Well, you can see here, right? On average, we've got the conversion between known to won is about 2.3%. And on average, it takes 99 days for this data set to move through the funnel, which is great, except when you look at the fact that 99 days only covers about 50% or so of the transactions or the conversions, right? And averages by definition is a centrist measurement. So you are going to generally expect that number to cover somewhere in the vicinity of 50%. The problem then is if you're basing your reverse waterfall exercise on this, even if you're taking velocity into account, you're only realizing 50% of the value of the leads that you brought in during that 99-day period. If you start looking further out and you start, let's say, being more conservative with your estimate, you'll see that, hey, you know what? If I want to capture 80% of the value, 80% of the bookings that the leads would generate, it takes closer to 130 days. You're talking about an extra month. If you want to be even more conservative, and I want to make sure I capture 90% of the value that these leads will generate, we're almost doubling. We're talking in the vicinity of 180 days, right, to capture approximately 90% of the value that these leads would generate. Once again, we're approaching doubling that sales cycle, right? And this could be the difference between hitting your goals and not hitting your goals, right? How you plan that out effectively and how you forecast that out effectively. And more selfishly, quite frankly, it could also be the difference between whether or not you get that performance bonus, right? And so that's the reason why it's important to dive in. That's the reason why it's important to own your data, because nuances like this can easily get lost in the shuffle. Here's a slightly different way to represent essentially that same data, right? You already know that I like to slice, conversion and velocity by channel, by acquisition channel anyway. And so we have a breakout here in various points of the funnel, right? In the upper left, we've got known to MQL, and then we've got MQL to SQL, SQL to WAN, known to WAN, et cetera, et cetera. You can start seeing kind of implicit immediately where you see some difference in performance, right? Conversion rates are pretty self-explanatory. I also pivoted though the velocity calculation to show something different. Instead of the number of days it takes to convert, I recalculated it to essentially represent the number of conversions, MAL to MQL conversions, you typically, on average, that you get in a month. So essentially what this means is you want the markers to move to the right, you want the bars to move to the right. That means better performance generally, right? And immediate jump out is that, inbound organic has high conversion rates and decent throughput. Inbound partner has decent conversion rates and very high throughput. And so, many of us might be patting ourselves on the back at this point in time, depending on what you're optimizing for, right? But if you start moving down funnel, you start seeing a slightly different story emerge, right? When sales gets involved, you can see that they're qualifying fewer of those leads and at a lower rate, especially when we're talking about inbound organic, which is now 4th on the list. Right, inbound partner referral, they haven't even really qualified any of those leads, and so there's no movement there. This isn't to say that this is a part of the reason why there's always so much contention, right, between marketing and sales, because you're looking at different things, you're looking at different parts of the funnel. Oftentimes, you're optimizing against different parts of the funnel. Move further down, right? From SQL to WAN, you see yet another story emerge, which is that, hey, you know what? Outbound sales seems to be, which is number 3 on that list here, seems to be generating the most throughput and as well as a decent conversion. Now, all of these 3 tell slightly different stories, but at the end of the day, the important thing is that we are all aligned on what we're optimizing against, right? Whether it's marketing or sales, executive or board, we need to make sure we understand what we're marketing against, optimizing against, and more importantly, these data points allow us to start meaningful conversations around how we optimize. Because, for example, just because outbound sales generated leads tend to have higher conversion, higher throughput, is that because sales really does prefer their own leads, or is it because the leads marketing is passing by, passing through is of low quality, right? Or is there some visibility issue? Like, you can't solve those problems with data. It does, data does allow you to prioritize those conversations and, know who to talk to and what topic to broach. And you guys will notice that, as we go through this, I'm a huge fan of bubble charts, right? This is just another way of illustrating that same thing, which is, hey, you know what? This allows us to, like, when you get deep into the data, it allows you to start looking for pockets of opportunity, right? And the pocket of opportunity here is, you'll see the bolded lines are essentially the averages, and you start seeing whether or not a particular channel or particular acquisition channel seems to be performing better across the funnel, across the conversion and velocity. And you can start having conversations around optimization, around process, around operations, whatnot, based on this data. So how do you do this? Well, you guys are starting to see the theme here as well, right? Like, I'm all about the granular data and how you kind of transform it in a way that yields valuable insights. And this is, once again, that same lead source architecture, lead source data capture that we have, right? And there's a very simple way to just kind of resort this, to rejigger this, to tell that same story that we just talked about, right? The problem is, you can't do this in your Marketos, you can't do this in your Salesforce, you can't do this in your Pardots. And some out-of-the-box tools will give you some capability, but rarely will they give you everything, kind of allow you to answer all of the questions that we're posing today. And so what you would do is essentially align your MQL date timestamps into cohorts, and then you calculate your average velocities. And then the rest is really just analysis and visualization. This is something that's very simple to do if you have the right tools. Another example of reporting that we do on a regular basis, right? Email reporting. Now, this might look pretty simple kind of at its surface, and it generally is, right? But one of the things that we were able to do is to look at the activity data, calculate all the open rates and click rates. Once again, that bubble chart there, right? Open rates and click rates, as you move up and to the right, as we're all accustomed to do as marketers, that generally indicates better performance. But what this allows you to do is to look at where you have the highest engagements, in particular emails. You could also group this by particular groups of emails, email topics, target audience, whatnot, to start yielding, hey, where are the pockets of opportunity for engagement? The size of the bubble in this case tells us the size of the audience, right? And so you've got the opportunity for engagement and then the opportunity for impact. And depending on how you slice and dice it, the colored circles could be, your audience, it could be individual emails, it could be email topics, like I said. But it starts getting you the insights around what email's performing, but not just which individual email's performing, but what themes and topics are performing. You can look over to the right to see, what links are driving some of those click engagements. You can start assessing, how to alter your email strategy to help improve engagement. One thing that I'm really proud of, I used to get it asked a lot, like, hey, you know what? We just sent out an email yesterday, or better yet, we just sent out an email this morning. How's it performing? Well, I can get you some initial data, but some of the analysis that we've done allows us to say that, typically it takes us about 7 days to get 99% of the emails, engaged. And this is actually, by the way, first-party data. I know you can look at industry data, you can get best practice, but I will tell you the reason we came up with this 7-day look back window is we actually analyzed the data set and said, hey, 99% of the time, if someone's going to open an email, if someone's going to click an email, they've done so within the 7 days, right? As a matter of fact, we get about 80% of them within the first 3 days. And so this starts allowing you to have more meaningful conversations, as well as optimization with members of the marketing team, members of the sales team, executive team, whatnot. How do you build this? Well, Marketo keeps a log of all the activities, right? We all implicitly use this in most marketing automation platforms. We implicitly use this to trigger activities, we trigger engagements and communication. However, we mostly probably don't effectively use it as a means of reporting and analysis. And this is the way the logs are typically stored, like approximately stored, I should say, within Marketo. Now, if you're able to extract this out into a system that allows you to do some transformation, then what you end up with is something closer to this, right? You can start by looking at, for this particular email on day 1, how many people opened, how many people clicked, how many people unsubscribed, right? Being able to align this to, like, anchor this to something gives us an apples to apples comparison. And once again, you roll this up across your audiences, you look for behavioral patterns that emerge between different segments, and there could be some really useful insights in there. One thing that you'll notice here is that, Nate is a little bit of a slacker, right? He got the email, took over a week to open the email, and then, the jerk unsubscribed, right? Me, on the other hand, I went, got the email, opened, and clicked. I'm a much better prospect. And you cannot do this analysis. You can't identify those people that are most likely to engage or most engaged unless you dive deep. Here's another example of what you could do. And this is a very tactical application of it. But essentially, there are no MarTech tools out there and a plug and play analytics tool out there that support this scenario typically, right? And what this is essentially analyzing the data to see completeness, right? If emails are important to you, companies are important to you, firmographics, demographics are important to you, track whether or not these things coming in or people coming in are giving you that information if you don't have that gating in place, right? A keystone deliverable of what we do at Atumos is lifecycle processing, right? And lead source processing. You can keep a pulse on how well these programs are working. And if you're looking at, engagement, right? Like how over time, how are people engaging or not engaging with you? It gives you kind of a high level pulse check that you can keep track of. Once again, you have to own your data to know this. One more scenario that I'm going to talk through, and it looks like I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to speed through this. But another scenario that you could accomplish through owning your data is, lead scoring through data science. Now, all of us know that there are, once again, canned solutions out there that can give you data science-based scoring. And the value prop of many of those companies are going to be the third-party data that they can match into your system, because really at the core of it, you've got everything that you need in your Marketo database, in your CRM to do some of this work yourselves, if all you care about is first-party data. And how would you do that? You need to anchor to a North Star, right? What are you optimizing against? In this case, you're optimizing against MQL to SQL conversions. And you're taking all of the aggregates of behavioral activity, right? And aggregating it at the user level. And you can see that's represented by lead ID here. You can even do some of this analysis in Excel, quite frankly, if you don't have a huge data set, right? Because you could run a multivariate regression, tools-based, right? Extract all the data. And how would I use this? I would take those correlations and I would take those coefficients, treat the coefficients essentially as a magnitude or magnifier, right? And p-values, for anyone who doesn't understand, that generally speaking, the lower the p-value, the more the higher correlation that there is between your independent and your dependent variables. Meaning, the lower the number, the more likely that particular activity or behavior or attribute that you're scoring, right, influences or has some correlative impact to your North Star, which in this case is MQL to SQL conversion. And so I would just use that, right, as a multiplier. Now, we're all used to doing kind of that finger in the wind scoring, right? You're all sitting here watching me blob on for about 45 minutes and sitting here thinking, okay, for this level of attention that I'm giving Eric, I better be getting scored highly within their lead scoring framework. And that's typically how we work. We implicitly equate effort to value or equate effort to intent, which is a great way to start. But what if you're able to take that a step further, right? And talk about what behavior really drives that conversion. I will wager that's going to be a lot more reliable and a lot more accurate in the long run. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually enable this, right? How do you get from the left, all your data sources, to the right? And some of you are going to look at this and it's going to be, hey, you know what? There's kind of a traditional data warehousing feel to this, and there is, right? The nice thing is there are tools that simplify this process for us, but 3 core things that we need to enable this type of analysis and reporting. You need a repository. You need a data pipeline. The data pipeline is to extract data from your source systems into your repository. And you need a discovery and transformation visualization tool. So something like a Power BI, something like a Tableau or Domo or something along those lines. Ideally, you also have an analyst. I would say it's not absolutely necessary if resource constraints a problem, but the core pieces are going to be those 3. And eventually you can start bringing in some of those other data sources, right? And really taking and tying and really tell that end-to-end data story. For the most part, I see investment in this area falling into 3 buckets, right? You've got your off-the-shelf solutions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Those are more the plug and play, right? The Visibles and the Bright Funnels of the world. You're all familiar with that, I'm sure. There are more packaged solutions, right, that require little or no IT support. Those are going to be your Domos and some of the CDPs. I know Caliber Minds has some capabilities in that arena, right? And I would typically recommend people start with something like this if you have little or no IT support in revenue systems, or you're building a marketing intelligence discipline ground up. And you've got kind of your more traditional approach, which is, you know, your full-on data warehouse, full-on data visualization suite, and full-on data pipeline, maybe even custom builds, right? The problem with this, though, is it requires a lot of resources. You may need a database administrator, you may need a custom dev to build out that pipeline, or you may need, and I should say, you will need some data visualization and discovery tools as well. And so that investment, while it's a lot more scalable, is going to be limiting for many of us in terms of resourcing. And, you know, depending on what your BI stack is, there are different solutions that allow you to, you know, there are different places to do the research that helps you build these solutions, right? And I'm not going to dive too much into this. You know, you can look up launch point information on Marketo. You can look in the App Store within Salesforce, and whatever BI stack is relevant to you. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to push us all as an industry, as you know, as a marketing discipline to move towards is for all of us to get to know, own, and activate our marketing data more effectively. All right, that's enough droning on from me. We do have a few minutes for question. So thank you very much. And Rusty, I'll hand that back to you, I think.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Eric. Thanks so much for you know, delving into that. I think it's a really clear picture and all the details and ins and outs. So fantastic there. We do actually have some questions that I'm glad we've got a chance to get to. So you'll have to listen to me drone on a little bit, but I want to make sure that we get all the questions answered that popped up. And I know you touched on it a little bit, but one of the questions that we had was around you know, kind of the architecture and the tools. So number one, we have this data coming in from multiple sources, our marketing automation platform, our CRM. Is there a best practice, something you see more often as a repository? Where would somebody start looking for a repository for that data to build out, like you said, a data lake or a data warehouse?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of that package solution that I was talking about earlier. We in-house use Domo, and the reason why we use Domo is because it's an all-in-one solution. You've got the repository. Domo has a collection of connectors to various marketing and sales systems and revenue systems built in. And so, you know, that's already like a huge chunk of what you need, as well as they have a visualization engine, right? And so that is a tool that you could have an analyst or even a marketing ops person own and start yielding insights on day 1 or, you know, at least day 5, I would say. depending on, you know, if you are a larger company and you have existing IT infrastructure, you may need to kind of go more of that traditional route. But if you're starting out, I definitely think we you know, start simple and where it requires less kind of resource management.
Perfect. Awesome. Good insight as far as the tool side goes. We had another question too around, you know, the way that you can slice and dice the data after you've kind of got it in your visualization tool. And it was about the, you know, the attribution point where we were tracking, you know, velocity and conversion to stage. Could that also provide insights into like multi-touch attribution, omni-channel campaigns? What can we extract from a kind of a campaign membership multi-touch attribution aspect?
Yeah, so great question. The conversion and velocity stuff that I talked about was primarily based on first touch. It's the lead source definition, so it doesn't change after the person comes in. And that's going to be useful in certain scenarios like, hey, you know what, is my sales team following up on certain leads that come in from certain channels versus not, right? But when we start getting into full attribution, you absolutely have to have that full end-to-end, every single touch to be fully effective. Now, I've used a couple of different data capture architectures to do this. You could do this using sales campaigns if you're syncing your marketing automation programs there into there effectively. You could also do this off of Marketo, right? And just look at exactly how I stitched that buyer journey together. The buyer journey was based off of Marketo programs and Marketo program membership dates, right? And you start stitching those dates together to see when Eric engaged with certain programs or when, you know, James engaged with certain programs. And once again, you overlay all of that to see whether or not patterns emerge. But you can do this. Most CRMs and marketing automation platforms will have that data available. It's not readily accessible.
Awesome. So, you know, in the case of maybe we don't have the marketing budget to go out and buy some of the more expensive off-the-shelf solutions, there are ways that we can extract that data and manipulate it. You know, I think you even used Excel as an example of a way to kind of manipulate the data and get to some of the data points that we're after.
Yes, absolutely. Excel is a good way to get started. I think the biggest problem is that some of these tools, like Excel doesn't have a native connector, for example, to Marketo, and it's easy enough to export lead data. But exporting things like program data, especially with the program membership dates, gets a little trickier. Exporting large swaths of activity data gets a little trickier. That's not to say you can't do it, right? You know, I've used smart lists and different Marketo reports to try to imitate some of that, but there is no replacement for really getting at that raw data that you have, that rich raw data that you have stored within each of these systems. Excel is a good way to get started if there's no resourcing available, but I do highly recommend if you value kind of that optimization and that attribution to start thinking about where you want to invest in marketing intelligence or business intelligence infrastructure.
Awesome. So yeah, a great way to kind of get the foot in the door if you don't have the budget yet, and hopefully, you know, being able to prove that ROI out on a small scale will then kind of increase interest for the larger investment in your marketing intelligence spend. So great. That actually brings us to the end of our Q&A. We've got all of our questions answered. So I'd like to once again thank Eric Wong for coming on and doing an amazing presentation on how to actually activate your marketing data, get it out of those silos and make something actionable out of that data. I'd also like to remind everybody that we do have 2 more of our MOPsCON spring preview sessions that are going to be coming up tomorrow. So if you haven't registered for those, please do go ahead and register for those 2 sessions, same times tomorrow. We'll be here. I'll be hosting again, and we'll have some more MOPS data and slides for you to go over and digest. This is meant to be a preview of our full-on MOPsCON, the kind of content that you can expect from our fall sessions coming up in September. As an additional resource, if you're not already a member of the MOPS Pros Slack group, highly suggest that you get in there, become a member, sign up. It's a place for all marketing ops practitioners to come ask questions, talk about tools, talk about the latest challenges. If you've got a challenge or you have a particular project that you're looking at doing, I'm sure that you're not the first. So it's a great kind of community where you can get answers to those questions from people who have probably been in the same position, have the answers. It's also just a lot of fun to get in there and talk shop with a lot of other MOPS pros. So look for that link. That'll also be coming out in the follow-up email. So make sure that you find that in your follow-up email and go ahead and get registered for the MOPS Pros Slack channel. I'd like to once again thank Eric for coming and presenting today. Thank you, Eric. And
Thank you.
yeah, for sure. Great information. These slides will be available. I'm sure you can follow up with Eric if you've got any other specific questions if you think about it after the fact. I'm Rusty Hall, and I'd like to thank all of our attendees today for all of the great questions and making a great interactive session. So look for us coming up tomorrow with 2 more sessions of the MOPsCON Spring Preview. Thank you all.